what I'm really trying to do is to question the presidential heroics. And the reason for this is that there is often a deification of presidential leaders that I think is a kind of a dangerous and ominous thing. When President Obama was elected, and even before he was elected, well, we all knew that he was a very charismatic person and had a huge, huge following. I mean, actually, when I see him on the news, I think he's very, very good. He has a very effective speaking style. He's very charismatic, very impressive kind of guy. Just that it worries me the kinds of actions that he's carrying along with that charisma. And so that kind of thing worries me. If people can be swept up in kind of a mob mentality, then they can forget about the principles behind their actions and can lose sight of what this country is really all about. Now, you can see from some of the polls of the presidents, and I have printed out one from the internet, and I'll circulate this as you can take a look. There's some dozen polls from different sources: the Wall Street Journal, the CNN, and the Schlesinger poll, and everything going all the way back as far as 1940 all the way up to 2009. Polls of what people thought of the best president. They ranked them from one through whatever it was the president at the time that they finished their. Well, some of them were earlier surveys than later ones, and they ranked them as to who was the one president that was best in American history, and then all the way down to one that they thought was the worst. So let me just go ahead and circulate that survey. The one who is listed as number one more than any other survey. I mean, there was a couple people that ranked him number two, but number one chronically was Abraham Lincoln. And so he has a broad reputation among the general population, among the media, among historians, as being the best American president. And number two, typically on there, ranked by most, can you guess who that would be? No, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Yeah. Now, in a couple of the surveys, in the Wall Street Journal surveys, Washington would have ranked maybe even number one. But most of the other surveys, he ranked maybe third or so. After that, the one who ranked maybe third or fourth among these was Woodrow Wilson. Now, it strikes me that the idea that strikes people as being a great hero is if they were victorious in war. It often struck me as strange that at President's Day in February, we were always celebrating the birthday of two presidents who were born close with birth dates very close together, and they were celebrating Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. And the irony of this struck me that, well, one was a hero because of independence, and the other one was a hero because of forced union. And it's seemingly opposite objectives. And then during the summer, we have the holiday for Kamehameha Day here in Hawaii, celebrating Kamehameha Day for forced union, and what a great hero he is, because we have the statue of him and all of this. And basically, he compelled all of the islands under his control. And then just a few weeks later, then we have the celebration for Independence Day, 4th of July, where we celebrated the fact that the American colonies were able to establish their independence from the most powerful military on the face of the earth at the time, the British Empire, and were able to establish independence from them, and establish for the first time a principled democratic republic that stood in contrast to the monarchies of those days. So here in Hawaii, we're celebrating Kamehameha Day, the conquest of a great monarch, and the independence from the monarch. Well, it seemed to me that maybe what was really being celebrated was victory. You know, because if the other guy had won, well, probably we'd all have holidays and celebrations and parades celebrating King George III and Jefferson Davis and people who might have won in the war had the war gone the other way. So all the more reason, it seems to me, for us to come back down to principle. What is it that we are looking for? Now, time and again, we've asserted that the principles that we hold very important and precious are individual liberty, the right to control our own lives, the right to control our own speech, and to be able to control our own religion, to control the product of our labor. And this is often expressed through an appreciation for low taxes, free trade, sound money, which is just another form of hidden tax when the government inflates currencies, debases the money. A small government that doesn't control our lives, simply protects us so that we may pursue our own ends. And a respect for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and basically leaving other people alone in pursuit of our own ends, what I call the non-aggression principle. We believe in protecting ourselves, but not in aggressing against others. Well, what troubles me a lot about Abraham Lincoln, who is quite an icon in the realm. You see him daily in the money, in the penny. His face is on the penny. Often the Lincoln Memorial is featured in numerous movies as the moment of great reflection and great wisdom. But one thing that strikes me is that not too often are people reflecting on the fact that this time when he came into office in 1860, well, when he was elected in 1860, took office in 1861. And here I've made just also a print from the internet, the division of the Electoral College and the division of the various states during that election in 1860. When he took office, it was a very contentious time, and it was a time of enormous transition, where people, in my view, some people were holding very solidly to the same principles that had been at the forefront of the Founding Fathers at the time of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution. But there were others who were striking out on a new course, and it was a deadly course. The American Civil War then ultimately led to the battlefield deaths of 620,000 soldiers on both sides, all Americans, both sides dying in the battlefields. Probably many more, tens of thousands, who knows how many thousands of civilians, but especially in the South, as the war came to a head towards the end, and especially with Sherman's march to the sea, and then the vast destruction of the countryside, the livelihood, the farms, the cities, with the bombardments on cities, the destruction of everything in the path of the marching forces. And it was a very, very deadly time. Casualties among the hundreds of thousands who then were maimed for the rest of their lives. And this was, if you compare this 620,000 military, that was about 2% of the total U.S. population of 30 million at that time. If you compared that same proportion to the population today, it would be the equivalent as a percentage of the American population today. It would be the equivalent of something like 6 million people who would have been killed if that was the same proportion of the population. 25% of white males aged 20 to 40 died in the South. And the cost of the war, just in the dollar figure, it seems small by comparison with what Barack Obama can spend with a flip of his finger today, but $6.5 billion was enormous, because actually what it reflected was that government increased 900% in its expenditures during this time of the war. Here's a little chart that shows government expenditures during the Civil War, World War I, World War II. Wartime always is a costly thing. It wasn't so much during the War of 1812 by comparison, but it's an enormous toll, not just in dollars, but as the growth of government is spurred on by these issues. Now, for some people, well, actually, if you ask people today around the country, what was the Civil War about? Most people would probably say, well, it was about slavery. It was to end slavery, and it ended slavery. And, well, you can forgive people, I think, for thinking that that was the sole issue, because that's probably what they're taught in schools, and probably what is usually Abraham Lincoln is thought of in association with today. I think a close examination of the Civil War era shows that it was an issue, but it wasn't as straightforward as we might think. Even if slavery was the issue of the day, was war the only way to resolve the slavery issue? And actually, most countries of the world, and I've got a list of all the countries of Latin America that solved the issue, ended slavery before the American Civil War throughout Latin America. As a matter of fact, by the end of the 19th century, the Western Hemisphere had ended slavery peacefully without bloodshed, with one exception. That was Haiti, where there was a slave revolt against the French slave plantation masters at the time. And all of Europe had ended slavery peacefully, without bloodshed. And as a matter of fact, when the United States became a country, all the states were slave states. There were more slaves in New York City as a percentage of the population, than any other city in the United States at the time the United States became a country. Slaves were across the country, but most all of the northern states had ended slavery prior to the American Civil War and without bloodshed. So it was a commonplace thing, and as a matter of fact, the thing that had changed the most in this country from the time of the Constitution with regard to slaves had changed in the North. The South hadn't changed. It was the North that had changed. Now, there were a lot of other issues. The usual process for ending slavery was, well, it was brought about a lot by a consciousness that was inspired by abolitionists early on. Mostly Christian abolitionists, I would say, who, and in this country it was probably the Quakers that were the first to assert the change in this. And it was, interestingly, it was in Massachusetts the first legalized the slave trade in the Americas in the 1600s. But it was the Quakers that brought on a consciousness about slavery. It was abolitionists, and even at the time of the Civil War, abolitionists probably numbered only about 2% of the population. So they had a big task ahead of them. Guys like William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of The Liberator, a very ferocious, fearless abolitionist who often faced threats of being tarred and feathered. His newspaper was burned down from time to time. He was chased from city to city whenever he would set up a speech and so on. He was a tireless and fearless, courageous advocate of abolition, and yet his numbers were very, very small. For the most part, the main issue in the North wasn't about freeing slaves because slaves deserve an equal station in life. For the most part, the issue in the North was not wanting white labor to be competing with slavery. They felt that it was an unfair competition, that slaves who weren't being paid, who hardly received any kinds of compensation, were competing with white labor. And that was the driving force in the North for most of the Northerners. Not all of them. There were fierce and courageous abolitionists, but they were very few in number. The main driving force was white labor not wanting to compete with black slaves. And interestingly, among the white population, there were 3 states that changed their constitutions to prohibit the immigration of free blacks into them. That was Illinois, Oregon, and Indiana. They just outright made a constitutional provision that no free blacks could be allowed into those states. Other states denied blacks the right to vote. Not all of them, but most of them denied the right to vote. All of them denied them the usual civil liberties of even being able to testify in court against whites, of being able to own property in many cases, of being able to engage in many kinds of occupations. And so the northern population did believe, as Lincoln, that they should not be slaves. But a lot of them believed, as Lincoln did, that the best thing to do with these unequal people, because he didn't really believe that they were on par with the white population any more than they thought the Indians or Mexicans or others as well. But the best solution, as far as Abraham Lincoln and many others thought, was deportation to Liberia. In fact, he invited several to the White House, leaders of the black community, including Frederick Douglass and others, to encourage their voluntary movement with taxpayer-provided funds to support their removal to Liberia or Panama or somewhere else in Africa. And they all turned him down. There were over 10,000, about 12,000 blacks who had gone back to Liberia, but the death rate was very high. Many of them perished in unfamiliar territory. It wasn't their homeland. They had been probably kidnapped by other populations and slave traders, other black populations and slave traders in collusion from all around African coastlines. And they weren't really going home. They were just going far away from the continent. We didn't want to go to Panama because most of the people who were going there were dying from yellow fever. In fact, when Horace Greeley wrote an editorial, a rather courageous editorial in the New York Tribune, calling for an end to the war, it was a courageous action because during these times it was pretty much illegal to have any voice of opposition to the president's policies and to the war. And we who hold freedom of speech and freedom of the press quite dear would have all been in trouble. Just for simply holding a meeting like this, we could have all wound up in Fort Lafayette with as many as 10,000 other people who were in opposition to the war effort, even for speaking out in any way against it, even for encouraging someone not to volunteer into the military. They could be arrested and sent to Fort Lafayette and wait out the remainder of the war. He had suspended habeas corpus, which means the right to face a trial, and due process. He had suspended this, and when it was challenged that it wasn't the president's prerogative to do this, it was an authority of the Congress. And this was even the ruling by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney. He just simply ignored it and continued on to do it. So we could all be arrested today for such an action if we were in any way opposing the session of the president at the time. He wrote a response to Horace Greeley saying, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union. Well, okay, so I suspect that the main motive behind this was not the issue was not slavery. As a matter of fact, it had been just shortly before this, in 1836, that the United States had sided with the Texans who had moved to a province of Mexico and sought secession. You know, we've all heard about the Alamo, the Battle of Sam Houston, Stephen Austin, Davy Crockett, David Bowie, all of them men rising up in rebellion against Santa Anna and Mexico. Well, actually, they were the ones that were trying to secede from Mexico. It had long been a territory of Mexico. And as a matter of fact, in 1829, Mexico had outlawed slavery. These new Americans that were coming in to settle there were bringing slavery with them. They wanted not only an annexation, a secession of that state from Mexico to set up their own independent republic, and they wanted to bring slavery with it. And the American government supported them in that because they were Americans against the Mexicans. Then in 1845, in a dispute over how big Texas was going to be, the United States sent its armies in what came to be known as the Mexican-American War, and went all the way down to Mexico City and conquered Mexico. And immediately after it took as part of settlement the whole of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was territory all the way out to California, encompassing Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and parts north, in which this was going to be territory now that by the Missouri Compromise was going to be opened up to slavery for the first time. So I would say that slavery was not foremost on the American minds. There were many who thought of it very highly, but for the general issues of the day, it wasn't the paramount issue. But what was? Well, let me say that one of the things that made slavery actually more entrenched was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Shortly after the Mexican-American War, there was this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in which the Dred Scott, following the Dred Scott decision, in which it was ruled that a slave could be taken by his master to a northern state, but that did not make him free in a northern state. He still belonged to the slave master. And if he didn't return, it was the police authority in the northern states that was obligated to return him as property that stole himself from his master. And so this essentially put a crunch on the Underground Railroad, or motivated the Underground Railroad. Now runaway slaves had to go all the way to Canada or to Mexico in order to escape their masters on the slave plantation. What made the slave feasible, economically feasible, was the fact that they could always count on the full authority of the police and the military throughout the country to return runaway slaves. Plantation masters could not have enforced, just economically, could not have enforced slavery without this. In fact, in the South, they even conscripted young white men to be on hunting patrols, slave hunting patrols, constantly going through the countryside, looking for runaway slaves and returning them to their masters. Without this conscription of the white population, the young white population in the South, and probably of the people who owned slaves in the South, probably a quarter of the population owned slaves, but 3/4 of the population didn't, and they were the poorer ones who were more likely to be vulnerable to these conscription hunting details to find and bring back slaves. If this had not occurred, I believe that slavery would not have been economically justifiable. And I think that just simply repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act would have brought about the death of the slavery in the South. And but there were other issues, I believe, that were probably of great concern during these times. And to address this, it has to do with taxes. Well, we all know how significant taxes are. We don't think often of the tariff today because tariffs seem very remote. We think of the income tax, which, by the way, was introduced by Abraham Lincoln during the war. We think of sales taxes, which, by the way, Abraham Lincoln introduced by spreading them much more during the war. Even licensing fees. Almost every occupation during the war required an occupational fee to be a carpenter, to be a draftsman, to be a blacksmith. You had to pay an extraordinary fee for an occupational license from the government at the time. And these were all introduced during the war as wartime measures for funding the war. At the time, the tariff was enormous. Now, the first time that the tariffs actually became, well, let me say not tariffs, but obstruction of trade. Now, this was a trade embargo, not allowing trade to go out of the country, was during the War of 1812. We had conflict with Britain. Many Americans wanted to take Canada and bring it back and have it become part of the United States. And there were other issues over British trade and conscription on the high seas and that sort of thing. But the northern states, it was the New England states that thought about secession for the first time when the national government said you're not allowed to trade with England. And the New England states, that was their main business, trading with England. And so they came together at the Hartford Convention and actually drew up articles, a proposal for the secession of New England states from the United States over this issue of not being allowed to trade. And it finally, the war ended before this convention proposal ran its course. But it was that close for New Englanders. There were Northerners who were abolitionists, who were desperately calling for, as was William Lloyd Garrison, calling for the North to secede from the South so that they no longer had to return slaves. And then there was the case in 1828, the Tariff of Abominations. And I have a listing here that shows what the tariffs were like. This shows what the tariffs were like in 1828. Very, very high tariffs. And that motivated the southern states to first start talking about secession. Then you'll see right here is the Morrill Tariff. That was the one that took place in 1860-61, just prior to the Civil War, and came to be the primary motivator for Southerners to brace against the new Republican administration that was coming in. These southern states objected to the tariff in this manner. The tariff was supposed to be just for the collection of revenues for the government, but the tariff was so high and so specific on textile products from England and other products from England that it became viewed not as a revenue enhancement for the government's general purposes, but to cut off trade from southern states, because 80% of the tax by this tariff was going to be paid by southern states that were doing a lot of trade, their cotton with England in exchange for goods from England. It was used as a way to cut off the trade from England. And then, since 80% of this money was going to be collected from the southern trade, where was it going to be spent? Well, since the population in the north had twice the population, they more easily were getting the funding for their various infrastructure projects. These were very corrupt insider deals with canal companies, railroad companies, road and toll companies to build lots and lots of infrastructure in the north. And they viewed this as a way of robbing the South in order to pay off deals in the North. And they protested, and they drew up articles of secession, which interestingly they called upon the Kentucky Resolution and the Virginia resolutions that were drawn up by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, arguing that when the national government was viewed as violating the Constitution, that states had a right to nullify the actions of government and to secede. Well, fortunately, Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, had no intention of letting them secede, but the people at that time had cooler heads and then worked out a compromise on the tariff. And they had a plan to drastically reduce the tariff, as you can see by the chart, in a very short period of time. It passed, it was very high, and then very shortly after that it was to be reduced considerably. And it went down until 1860, when the new Republican Party in power was adding now the Morrill tariff, which was a huge tariff increase. It was a 15% average tariff on products up to a 50% average tariff on products. And since that's the main tax that people were paying in those days, it was a huge increase on their a burden on their livelihood and their economic activity. So that was a major issue of contention. I would argue that had cooler heads prevailed, 620,000 soldiers didn't have to die in a confrontation, that things could have been worked out as alternatives to moderate this tariff, to eliminate such reinforcements of slavery as the Fugitive Slave Act, and so on. Finally, I would say that even if those things didn't work, that it would have been wiser and more principled and more on the basis of American history to let the South go, because the Declaration of Independence asserted that the rule of the country, the government derives its just authority from the consent of the governed. If those people had such objection to being a part of the Union, that, as Jefferson and Madison argued, it was a voluntary union and they had a right to leave. Now, Lincoln asserted that it was a perpetual union. They didn't have a right to leave. Once they joined, they were forever joined. He said that it's like a contract. You can't just a contract of both parties, and it had to be separated. It had to be agreed upon by both parties. Well, imagine, for example, the union of a husband and wife. And if one found it intolerable to be together and he or she decided to divorce, was the better option to shoot them? I think not. I think the practice of American principle before had always been let them go. That's what the American founding fathers expected at the Tea Party. When the British, when they announced their independence, they believed they had a right to determine their authority. In fact, an obligation by the Constitution. When they felt that the authority was abusive of their power, they had a right to nullify that and to select their own leaders. What might have happened? In my view, well, first of all, this is the kind of thing that the United States had done all along. Here's a little map of what the United States did in helping Texas, California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico secede from Mexico. As a matter of fact, when they seceded from Mexico, that was 2/3 of the land area of Mexico. A pretty big secession. And Americans fought on the side of secession, as they did during the American Revolution. They also fought on the side of secession in a number of other cases. Throughout history, we've seen the Americans fought on the side. Teddy Roosevelt actually stood on the side of the Panamanians who were seceding from Colombia. course, America had its interest in trying to have an independent country that they would approve of the canal, but still, that was where they stood, on the side of the Panamanian secession from Colombia. The United States has a long history of standing on the side of those who were secessionists. Bangladesh, when breaking away from, when East and West Pakistan broke apart and Bangladesh seceded. Taiwan, wanting to secede from mainland China. South Korea, South Vietnam. Kosovo, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Montenegro. Now suppose that Quebec has a vote and they say, well, we wish to secede from Canada. Surely the United States wouldn't think that it would be appropriate for the Canadian government to go and attack the country and force them to be a part. The United States has always been respectful of the Québécois, the French quarter, and that they have a legitimacy in secession thing. It could be that it's a temporary thing until conditions change, as they often do. And then, once again, there could be a remerger. There may have well been a remerger of the two parties as time passed. And it certainly would have been a lot easier to see a remerger if it had been allowed a divorce peacefully. Now, I would say there were other problems with Lincoln's rule, and that was, for one thing, I think that, in my opinion, he disregarded the Constitution and the Bill of Rights on just about every possible grounds. If you look at the Bill of Rights, he was very pervasive in his suspension of habeas corpus unilaterally, meaning without the consent of Congress, or without the initiation of Congress. But later, Congress did go along with it, but by then, he had already had a very pervasive system of control over the press. There's one book here that has an interesting account of this. This is by Jeffrey Hummel, who wrote about these conditions. Nevertheless, the Lincoln administration imprisoned at least 14,000 civilians throughout the course of the war, and state and local authorities probably seized many more. Seward even took preliminary steps toward the arrest of former President Franklin Pierce. Quite often, these jailings were for other than political reasons, as were 4 leaders of a munitions workers' strike at West Point in 1864 were held without trial for 7 weeks. Congress finally sanctioned Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus in March of 1863, which added procedural safeguards for the arrested. But the president neglected to implement the safeguards. Congress had also passed earlier conspiracy and treason acts to facilitate the prosecution of anti-war activities in civilian courts. The federal government simultaneously monitored and censored both the mails and telegraphs for the first time, demanded passports of those entering and leaving the country. No one eligible for the draft could depart. It also suppressed newspapers. Over 300, including the Chicago Times, the New York World, and the Philadelphia Evening Journal, had to cease publication for varying periods. If the Postmaster General banned an anti-war paper from the mail, it had received the kiss of death. Early in the war, a special congressional committee, relying primarily upon anonymous informants, conducted sweeping investigations in order to root out disloyalty among government employees. Lincoln was not only reticent about justifying these invasions of liberty, one of his arguments was based upon the danger of desertion. Nor did the president have any constitutional reservations about ignoring the legislative branch of convenience. Starting with his initial militia call, Lincoln repeatedly invoked the war emergency to increase presidential power. He enlarged the regular army, clamped down the blockade, dispersed government funds, authorized government borrowings, but suspended habeas corpus and instituted postal censorship before Congress even convened. There was one congressman, Comment Vallandigham, a Democratic congressman from Ohio, who became a cause célèbre. Vallandigham had denounced Lincoln on the House floor, and instead Lincoln had him arrested and deported, carried across the lines to the Confederate States, and left there. He finally on his way back up through Canada, back into the country where he was nominated to be governor of Ohio. So there were a lot of even interventions with the churches. It was mandatory that the sermons had to be censored first before they could be given. One case involved a minister who was arrested because he didn't give the required prayer to the administration during the service. Now, I find these very disturbing. It's very hard for a country. Of course, as he viewed it, it was very hard to conduct the war if there were going to be people in the background who were going to be giving him trouble. But on the other hand, that's what a free society is supposed to be all about, to question and challenge the actions of government. And without those ability to question and challenge, you have runaway power that can be very much abused. And he confiscated guns in the border states. Anyone who had guns, they were all confiscated. So how could you protect yourself if there was any reason to? So I'd say he violated the First Amendment, he violated the Second Amendment, he violated by quartering troops wherever he went, he violated the Third Amendment, he violated the Fourth Amendment by search and seizure, he violated the Fifth Amendment, he violated the Seventh, and certainly the 10th Amendments. I think that there were very, very strong violations, and he packed the courts with favorable men so that he couldn't be challenged. There were cases of elections where he had people. The entire Maryland legislature was arrested as soon as they won their election and were to take office. They were all arrested and sent to Fort Lafayette because they were suspected of having secessionist sympathies. Well, under those kinds of circumstances, you can't even have a free election, and you can't. And when he needed more soldiers, he instituted the draft, the military draft, which the draft riots in New York City alone resulted in the deaths of more people than they drafted from New York during those years. It was a horrendous bloodbath, and a lot of the people who died were innocent, free blacks walking the streets who were lynched by the mobs who resented the fact that they were going to be conscripted to go off and fight a war in the South that was being perceived as being one that was to fight for their freedom. He announced the Emancipation Proclamation, but at the time he announced it, it did not free a single slave because it only applied to states still in rebellion. The states that were slave states in his control, it didn't free a single slave. It only freed a slave that was in a state in rebellion, which was intended to motivate them to rise up against their slave masters. But it didn't do anything to free a slave in the areas that he controlled. And often there were even states that once they took them under control, the slaves were then put back into slavery because now they weren't in rebellion. Other problems had to do with money. He introduced money. You see him on the face of this money here. And what happened was that he reduced the value of a dollar in gold to essentially this. He reduced it to about a third of what it was before by debasing the currency. Printed the greenbacks. Well, why did people accept these? They had always been used to accepting currencies from private banknotes. Well, he put a 10% tax on every banknote and drove them out of business. He established the National Banking Act, which established the first, we had national banks before, but this was a National Banking Act which for the first time required every bank to have a national charter and buy government bonds supporting the war effort in order to even have permission to have a bank. And then only they could issue the greenbacks, which had the legal tender standing, and the value of the money dropped to 35% of its purchasing power, which means a tax of 65% on the value of anyone's wages and savings and pensions during those times. Another thing that was a problem with it was that the government expenditures went up 900%, and a huge amount of it during the war was simply to start funding the massive railroad projects of very corrupt companies, the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific, the pass this along here. You'll see at the top here, there's one railroad, the Great Northern Railroad, at the top here, that received no subsidies from the government. No land. Now, all of these other railroads received an enormous amount of land. In the case of the Central Pacific, it was 6 miles in alternating sections throughout the whole pathway of the route, and for the Northern Pacific and Southern Pacific, it was more like 20 miles. These were huge swaths of land. The size, the amount of this land, if put all together, would be equal to the size of the state of California. It was an enormous amount of land. And all of these railroads that were heavily subsidized by the government to build them, they funneled off all of their road proceeds into the construction companies, which were privately and separately owned, and the railroads all went bankrupt. All went bankrupt. But the only one that didn't go bankrupt and received no subsidies, no land, no government loans was the Great Northern, built by James Jerome Hill. And these were all instigated as part of the infrastructure projects that Lincoln was a part of. He was a corporate lawyer, the wealthiest, highest paid lawyer in Illinois, working for the Illinois Central Railroad. And interestingly, the end of the railroad was going to start at Council Bluffs, where he happened to have a huge plot of land. So there's a number of issues that I have with him over those things. Today, I would, he'd be considered, a major corporate financier in a very inefficient manner. James Jerome Hill produced the first transcontinental railroad without a penny of that government support. So, okay, I've said enough in my contest to the issue of having Abraham Lincoln glorified. Now give me the arguments where I went wrong. Okay, so thank you.